people's days are filled with the monotony of checking. I'm going to check this, I'm going to check that, is this okay, what's happening with those, what's the thing with those? And I mean, if you sort of fast forward into the future, if you gave the physical world the ability to help make decisions and fix itself, it becomes a really interesting question, and now we're getting a bit esoteric about, well, what are people going to fill their days with?
Yeah, and we go back to this whole conversation we've had on multiple episodes of this podcast about what happens in a world of singularity, where computers are at the same level as the human brain, and a number of jobs that are currently about checking or auditing or maintenance somehow get replaced by machines, by AI. And I talked a couple of times about Skynet and Arnold Schwarzenegger. I noticed there's a new Terminator film out.
Apparently it's very good. It fixes really? All the other terrible ones.
I can't understand how he, being, what was he, 75 or something, would be able to be.
Well, he's just an aging.
He's just an aging robot, right? So, but I think it's a really interesting discussion that we're seeing more about how the human condition, how human beings will operate in a world where many of today's jobs are probably not going to exist in tomorrow's world, and what will happen with that spare capacity that we have in human minds. And we talked about the two schools of thought. One is that people will need to live on universal basic income because there will be nothing for them to do, and we'll have a situation where we'll have to care for human beings rather than allow them to continue to create a better world. Or this sort of other school of thought, which is by automating some of these more mundane jobs, if we want to call them that, which are checking or auditing or whatever, that there is more space for human beings to go and develop new things, to create new avenues, new engines of growth. And we've seen this a number of times, a number of guests on the podcast have talked about this. This is not the first industrial revolution we've gone through.
No.
They're calling it the fourth industrial revolution.
And it's interesting, right? And people will sometimes call that the fourth industrial revolution is either augmented workers or data or the rise of AI or those sort of things. If you have a look at, famously we always talk quite a bit about construction being a very undigitally disrupted sort of business, right? And agriculture, up until a couple of years, was right underneath. And one of the really interesting things about how the agricultural industry has disrupted itself is they spent a bit of time trying to work out what the actual core problem was. So everybody knows a lot of people are leaving the agricultural industry. It's becoming, not so much generations upon generations of farmers. And everybody was fairly convinced that the problem state that needed to be fixed by digital in agriculture was that you didn't have enough farmers. So there's been a really interesting study by University of New South Wales, which has actually come up with a different theory, which is actually the challenge that most modern farmers have is they don't have enough agronomists. And so when you're working in a farm, you can all agronomists can be farmers, but not all farmers can be agronomists, right? So it's this catch-22. And so a lot of people using traditional farming methods would maybe get access to an agronomist once, twice, maybe once every 5 years. And they're the guys who'll look at what's happening in the soil, understand what's happening with companion planting, looks at the type of animals you're using, the patterns that you want to have for grazing, and will actually give you a strategy on how you can get the best yield out of your property. And so previously, agriculture tech's all been really focused on replacing farm workers. But what they've actually been starting to do in this experiment on is, what if you could provide an agronomist 24/7 to every farmer? So starting to use things like autonomous robots and other testing equipment. So what you're doing is you're actually allowing farmers to be much more efficient and actually focus on the job of farming, rather than having to spend all their time trying to become agronomists and soil specialists and water things and everything.
And this is the whole unscaled concept we've been talking about a lot recently.
Exactly.
Right? Where it's a rental model of capacity. So rather than the current world where scale is everything, and you build scale, and the bigger scale you have, the more markets you can go into, we're now looking at sort of a descaling as people start to rent capacity from one another. And a great example, one of our graduates, Marika Zvikas, who's a wonderful and intelligent young woman who has a side hustle, which is a term I learned recently, because I'm sort of really hip now.
You're up with the kids.
I'm up with the
Good
kids.
works.
She makes jewelry. And, you know, I think, oh, you make jewelry, you know, you can put it together, hammer it out or whatever, and she sells it at markets. And I had this whole hippie concept, you know, in my head. No, that's not quite how it works. She designs this jewelry on CAD, which she has at home. She then sends it off to a factory, which is a 3D printer. It prints it, and she does batches of 20 or 30, and then it comes back, and then she sort of finishes it by hand, and then sells it at market. So if that's the new version of a hippie jewelry seller, it
That's
just gives
pretty
you an
good.
example of what kind of world we're moving into.
And